evening, everyone. This is Scraticus, and this evening I'll be reading A Simpler Time by DJLowrider. Twilight Sparkle levitated the last bolt of fabric over to the shelf it belonged on, and took a step back to admire her work. She'd arrived at Carousel Boutique almost an hour ago to meet Rarity for a promised tea time, and had discovered Ponyville's fashionista in the midst of one of the worst messes she'd ever seen. The place looked like it had been hit by a hurricane, and Rarity had confirmed that such had been the case, at least figuratively speaking. The hurricane had gone by the name Cutie Mark Crusaders, who had insisted on trying to help Rarity clean up the boutique. Yesterday had been the annual Nightmare Night Festival, and Rarity hadn't participated in it due to fussing too much over her own costume. As a result, her work area had looked more like a disaster area, even before the Crusaders set to their work. While Twilight was still not privy to the results of the girls' endeavour, she felt it was safe to assume that it had not ended well, evidenced not only by the state of the boutique, but also the nervous twitch that had plagued Rarity's right eye when she first arrived.
"I can't thank you enough for your help, Twilight,"
Rarity said, sighing exhaustedly as she looked around the tidied workroom.
"Much as I know my sister and her friends have their heart in the right place, I would appreciate it if they would learn some respect for other ponies' property. Not to mention better tidying skills."
I'll have a word with Cheerily and see if she can try to reinforce that with the girls at school sometime soon.
Twilight told her after stifling a chuckle.
And you're quite welcome, by the way. For all the times you've helped me clean up the library, the least I could do is return the favor.
Well, let's not waste much more time here. A cup of tea and a daffodil sandwich sound quite right to me. And it'll be my treat, so don't you dare think about paying today. It's the least I can do to show my gratitude for your help. Let me just put up my close signs in the shop below, and we'll be on our way.
As Rarity set to the task of temporarily closing up shop, Twilight looked back around Rarity's working space. Fabric, thread, and various accoutrements lined the shelves, all neatly organised thanks to their joint efforts. One thing, however, caught her eye on a high shelf at the back of the room. It was a small red pile of cloth that looked rather old. With Rarity still downstairs closing up shop, Twilight levitated the cloth down to her and looked it over. It was a filly-sized costume in the shape of a lobster. Something about it seemed oddly familiar to Twilight, and she found herself searching her memories for what it could be. It came to her in an instant. A day almost lost to her memory because it had happened so long ago. She looked back at the costume again and felt a mixture of feelings, surprise and bewilderment to name two, but more than anything else she felt rather amused at the discovery. Twilight remained in stunned silence at her discovery, clear up to where she realized Rarity was standing right behind her, having finished closing up the shop.
"Something wrong, Twilight dear?"
Rarity asked, concerned for her friend's silence and frozen stance.
Oh no, nothing's wrong at all.
Twilight said, now smirking as she turned towards her.
Red Lobster,
she added as she levitated the costume up between her. Rarity gasped and quickly took telekinetic control of the costume from Twilight, immediately sending it back up onto its shelf.
"How did that end up there?"
she asked in a panic.
"And hold on a second. How did you know about—"
Twilight cleared her throat and picked her voice up a bit as to imitate herself when she was younger.
Roger that, Red Lobster. Celestia's speed be with you,
she said, smiling at Rarity once again.
"Bookfort,"
Rarity said. Her voice was a whisper as the memory now also came flooding back to her mind.
"It's not possible. All those years ago, that was—"
It's a small world after all, isn't it?
Twilight commented.
Come on, let's reminisce over some tea and sandwiches.
Rarity nodded and fell in alongside Twilight, still quite stunned at the realization that while they shared a common bond through their cutie marks with their other four friends, the reality was that their friendship between the two of them went back even further. Many years earlier.
"Mother, please! I want to go shopping with you!"
A little filly Rarity pleaded as she tried to keep pace with her mother.
"I'm sorry, Rarity, but Mommy needs to do a lot of shopping today, and J.C. Bites's isn't just one of the foremost department stores in Canterlot,"
her mother told her as they approached the famous store.
"It's also one of the largest, and you'll get quite tired of walking around everywhere I need to go. I'm sure you'll find a way to occupy yourself at the store's daycare."
"But, Mommy, we don't get to come to Canterlot much,"
Rarity whined.
"I want to have fun with you."
"I'm truly sorry, dear. Sometime I'll promise we'll come back and have a special Mother-Daughter Day. but this is how it has to be this time.
Rarity was on the verge of tears as they entered the store and went over to its daycare centre. After her mother spoke a bit with the mayor who was on duty, she kissed Rarity on the head and told her she'd be back later, as Rarity was corralled inside. Rarity stood glaring angrily down at the floor for several moments. She was bound and determined to be miserable. For her to be stuck all alone in the daycare while her mother got to go shopping was simply awful in her mind. Just as she was ready to begin pitching a massive fit, she heard a rustle come from across the room. She finally looked up and saw the most curious sight she'd ever seen. On the other side of the room stood 2 large stacks of books, and between them sat another young unicorn filly that looked roughly her own age. She had a purple coat, mane and tail that were primarily indigo, but with 2 streaks that were pink and lavender in colour. She sat on the floor with her face buried in a book in front of her. Rarity didn't know what to make of her, especially considering that she sat in the middle of what looked to her like a fortress made of books. But company was company, and she'd rather at least have some pony to talk to than spend the next few hours in silence. She took a deep breath and approached the other filly cautiously as she thought about what to say to her first. The bookish filly that Rarity was approaching, whose name was Twilight Sparkle, had lost herself in the book that sat in front of her. It was her only respite from reality for now, a reality that she was none too pleased with. She certainly did want to make sure they could give her father a proper birthday party that weekend, but she had desperately wanted to stay with her mother while she shopped. Her mother, however, insisted on leaving her at the store's daycare, reminding her that she got tired easily from too much walking around. This wasn't Twilight's first visit to the daycare at JC Bitsy's, but she was fortunate this time. Not only had she been the only child there at the time, but there was a whole new set of bookshelves filled with books to read. She'd quickly pulled down all the books that looked interesting to her, and, after stacking them up neatly on either side of her, had set to the task of reading as many of them as she could until her mother came back to pick her up. She was mostly through her 3rd book when a white unicorn filly with an impeccably groomed violet mane and tail walked over and stood near to where she sat reading.
Good day to you,
Rarity said after deciding that her best bet was to try to make a good first impression using her well-practiced manners. Twilight gave her only the slightest nod in response, and she seemed to barely register that there was any pony else around her.
I guess we're both stuck here until our mothers come back for us,
Rarity noted, looking around the otherwise unoccupied daycare area. This time, Rarity's comment apparently didn't warrant a response of any kind.
So, what are you reading?
Rarity asked, looking curiously down at Twilight. Twilight held her book up without closing it to show the cover to her.
Is it interesting?
Rarity asked, feeling more and more uneasy with every passing moment. Twilight resumed reading for a moment before finally giving her a vocal response.
Unique.
Was all she said.
Which part?
All of it.
I guess you really like books then?
Relatively.
I see. Do you, come here often?
I guess.
I wish I could, but Canterlot is quite far from where I live.
Huh?
Rarity grumbled a bit as it was now clear the other filly wasn't paying her much mind at all.
Are you this rude to every pony or just me?
She asked, sounding fairly annoyed.
Huh?
Twilight said, only now looking up at the white unicorn filly standing in front of her. She immediately shrank back a bit, looking up at Rarity timidly. Rarity immediately felt bad for frightening her.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm just still a bit upset is all. I wanted to go shopping with my mother, but I guess I'm still too little to keep up with her.
It's okay.
Twilight said, feeling a little less nervous after Rarity's apology and explanation.
I really don't like it much here either, but when Mommy needs to come shopping, I have to stay here. I get tired pretty easily, so I can't really go with her yet. At least there are books to read this time, though.
You really do seem to like books a lot, don't you?
Rarity asked, noting the towers of books that sat on either side of Twilight.
Books are fun.
Twilight said as she closed her book, set it aside and pulled another one down off one of the towers.
They tell stories or teach me things, and they don't laugh at me or make fun of me for being different.
I didn't mean to seem like I was making fun of you.
Rarity told her apologetically.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Anyway, I suppose I'd better find something to do to pass the time. My mother won't be back for me for quite a while.
You You want to read a book?
Twilight asked timidly.
I only grabbed so many because I was the only one here before. I'd feel bad if I hogged all of the books like this.
Reading a book.
Rarity said, considering the idea as she looked over the book stacks once again.
I suppose there are worse ways to spend time. Which one should I read?
Well, I was about to start this one here.
Twilight said, pointing down to the book in front of her.
You could read it with me if you want.
Rarity shrugged, and after they'd adjusted the piles of books to provide space for the both of them, began reading along with Twilight. It was a science fiction story about a rebellion in space against an evil empire, complete with a climactic battle with spaceships. Both fillies found it quite fun to read and even began chattering with each other about their favourite scenes.
I must say, this isn't the sort of thing I usually get to read at home.
Rarity said as she finished the book some time later.
It was a very fun story, though.
I know, right?
Twilight said excitedly.
Sometimes after I read stuff like this, it makes me want to pretend that I'm in the story and I play out some of the scenes. Only, well, I don't have any pony my age to play with, really. I end up playing alone with my dolls and toys.
Rarity frowned at the thought of being so alone.
That sounds quite lonely,
she said. Twilight shrugged at her.
I'm kind of used to it.
Rarity fell silent and looked around the room, noting that they were still the only two children present. She then looked back at Twilight and smiled at her.
Well, you could play with me.
She suggested.
We could pretend we're fighting in the last big battle in the story. Only if you want to, of course.
Really?
Twilight asked hopefully.
You'd play with me?
Rarity nodded to her and found herself immediately hugged by Twilight. She was unaccustomed to such displays of affection, especially from a filly she'd only just met, but found herself smiling all the same. It didn't take long for the two fillies to restack the books into something resembling a fortress like what the rebels in the story had for their home base. They also set up the building blocks into a shape similar to the Empire's main battleship. With their stage set, Rarity looked around the room for something that she could add to her appearance, since she was going to pretend to be a fighter pilot. She spotted a trunk full of play clothes and costumes and quickly went through it, settling on what turned out to be a lobster costume. In truth, she'd only picked it because the character she was pretending to be had been called Red Leader, and the costume was, of course, red.
Red Lobster, standing by!
Rarity said, taking on a serious expression as the game was now on.
Come in, Bookfort. Over.
This is Bookford,
Twilight said, poking her head out from the fortress of books.
I copy you, Red Lobster.
Bookfort, I'm beginning my attack run.
Rarity said as she trotted around the edge of the room, eyeing the battleship made out of blocks warily.
Roger that, Red Lobster.
Twilight replied.
Celestia's speed be with you.
Rarity turned sharply and dashed towards the ship, veering off just before reaching it. She came back round and made another pass, this time speeding right in front of it.
Bookfort, the Empire's battleship shields are too strong!
She cried out.
My lasers aren't doing anything to it!
Aim for the control tower, Red Lobster.
Twilight replied.
If you can knock that out, the battleship shields will fall and you can take it out once and for all.
Copy that, Bookfort. I'm on it.
Red Lobster, watch out! Enemy fighters are incoming!
I see them, Bookfort. I'm taking evasive maneuvers.
Rarity quickly doubled back a ways away from the battleship, pretending she had several enemy fighters now pursuing her.
I'm under heavy fire, Bookfort!
Reinforcements are on the way, Red Lobster.
Twilight said as she began crawling out of the fort.
In the meantime, do a barrel roll.
Rarity quickly dropped to her stomach and rolled over and over several times before jumping up again and rushing back towards the battleship. She swiped at the very top of it, toppling over a few blocks that scattered to the floor.
I've taken out the control tower!
She called out.
But I've still got one enemy fighter on me! I can't shake them!
Yee-haw!
Twilight cried out as she crossed paths right behind Rarity, pretending to take out the last enemy fighter.
You're all clear, Red Lobster. Now let's blow that thing and go home.
Twilight and Rarity both bore down on the battleship and pounced on it, utterly demolishing it and sending blocks bouncing all over the daycare center's floor. They both laughed and celebrated their victory as they made their way back over to the book fort, both of them a bit winded from the activity.
That was a lot of fun,
Twilight said energetically.
Let's find another story to play out.
I'm all for that.
Rarity said, also still feeling a bit of a rush from the game.
You're really quite fun to play with, you know.
Thanks. You're one of the nicest fillies I've ever met. Most of the ponies my age that I meet just call me a nerd or a geek or something like that.
Well, I'm not most ponies.
Rarity said proudly as she sat down while Twilight picked another book. Twilight just smiled at her as she set the next book down for them to read. Not too far into the story, however, both fillies found themselves yawning and feeling their eyelids getting heavier and heavier. When Rarity's mother came by the daycare to pick her up sometime later, she found her daughter still wearing the lobster costume and sound asleep next to Twilight. Quietly and carefully she made her way over to the pair of sleeping fillies and hefted Rarity up onto her back. It made for quite the load along with the rather full saddlebag she was carrying, but it was nothing she wasn't used to.
Bookfort.
Rarity mumbled in her sleep.
Let's play some more.
Shh.
Her mother told her softly.
Just stay asleep, dear.
After promising the mare on duty at the daycare that she'd wash and return the lobster costume another time, Rarity's mother made her way out of the store and began the trek to the Pegasus chariot service that would ferry them back to Ponyville. Just as she left the store, Twilight's mother arrived to pick her up as well. She, likewise, got her daughter up onto her back and made her way out of the store, after thanking the mare on duty as well.
Red Lobster,
Twilight murmured as she stirred on her mother's back.
can we be friends?
Sounds like you've had quite the full day, honey.
Her mother told her quietly.
Time to get home so I can make you that dinner I promised.
Both fillies slept peacefully for the remainder of their respective journeys home. It didn't occur to either of them until much later that day that for all the playing and reading together they had done, they hadn't once exchanged names.
After I realized that I'd never found out your name that day, I was devastated.
Rarity said to Twilight, who sat across from her at the table at the cafe. 2 empty teacups and the remnants of a pair of daffodil sandwiches sat on the table between them.
Mother did intend to return the lobster costume, but I begged and pleaded with her not to. I wore it as my Nightmare Night costume for the next 2 years, thinking maybe I'd see the filly I only knew as Bookfort, and that she would recognize me in it. Obviously that never happened, but I kept the costume anyway as a reminder that somewhere out there was a pony who had been my friend on a day when I was in dire need of one.
I always did enjoy Nightmare Night as a filly, but Canterlot had its own set of celebrations for the festival.
Twilight replied.
I never got to come to Ponyville's festival until this year. That day at the store stuck in my memory for a long time, though, and eventually I even made up an imaginary friend based on the filly I only knew as Red Lobster. The book we'd read that day became an all-time favorite of mine, and I've gone back to read it countless times since then. Not because it's a good read, but because it was the story that helped me find my first real friend.
I just can't believe I never realized it was you until today, Twilight. I can't help but feel a little foolish.
Imagine how I feel. I always remembered the filly I'd played with was a white unicorn with a purple mane and tail. I feel downright stupid for not realizing it was you when I first came to Ponyville.
Rarity put one of her forehooves under her chin thoughtfully.
I suppose this just means we've always meant to be friends. It's just a shame it took us so long to get back together.
I imagine both our lives might have been pretty different if we had stayed in touch somehow.
Twilight said with a slightly sardonic laugh.
To say the least, darling, I could have made you so much more popular in school with a few choice outfits.
And I probably could have helped you get better marks in school with some better studying habits.
Both unicorns couldn't help but have a fit of giggles at their own comments. Once they'd finally calmed down again, Rarity paid the bill for their visit to the cafe, just as she'd promised, and the two prepared to leave.
Do you think we should tell the girls about our history, Rarity?
Twilight asked her as they headed away from the cafe.
Much as I'm sure they'd be curious to know about our true first meeting, I'd rather just keep this between the two of us, if it's all the same by you, Twilight.
Rarity told her.
I have a feeling I'd never hear the end of the whole Red Lobster bit from at least 2 of them, if not more.
I guess I can appreciate that.
Twilight said, stifling another giggle.
Do you mind if I ask you something, Twilight?
Rarity asked, with clearly something on her mind.
Not at all, Rarity. What is it?
Do you miss those times when you were younger? You know, when life wasn't quite so complicated? When you felt more certain about what tomorrow would bring? And every day seemed a little brighter?
Twilight stopped walking as she gave Rarity's question some thought. As she formed her response in her head, she couldn't help but grin at her friend again.
I can understand your yearning for a bygone time, Rarity.
She said.
And you'll have to pardon me if I answer your question with another one. But for as blissful and pure as those times may have been back then, Would you really trade any of your time now with your friends for one more day as a filly who was all alone and wondering if she'd ever see her best friend again?
Twilight's response, despite being a question, was as spot-on of an answer as Rarity could have wanted. She smiled in return as they began walking once again.
I wouldn't trade even so much as a heartbeat,
she told Twilight.
Simpler times may seem attractive when one looks back on them, but nothing beats the here and now.
I couldn't agree more,
Twilight replied. A thought then occurred to her related to their entire talk that afternoon.
Would you mind if I wrote a letter to the princess about our talk today, Rarity?
She asked.
By all means, Twilight. I was thinking of doing the same myself, actually, if it's all right by you.
Absolutely. Oh, and don't worry, I'll leave out the part about the costume in my letter.
Yes, I would thank you for that, dear. I dare say Princess Celestia knowing about that would be even more mortifying than any of our friends knowing.
As they reached Carousel Boutique, the two friends bid each other farewell for the day, and Twilight turned to return to her library to write her letter and do some more research.
Oh, Twilight, one more thing.
Rarity called out after her. Twilight stopped and turned to face her again.
Do you suppose I could borrow that book sometime? I think I'd like to read it again, for old time's sake.
Whenever you'd like, Red Lobster,
Twilight called back with a smile before trotting off again.
Thank you, Bookfort,
Rarity said with another soft laugh as she headed into her store.
Thank you, old friend.
Snow Day by Artimae. Snowstorm's eyelids fluttered open, disturbed by the gentle rays of the sun penetrating through thin curtains hanging in front of a nearby window. She sat up slowly, stretching a pair of white forelegs, accentuated with the dull gray color of smoke between her fetlocks and knees. She exhaled a silent yawn, delicately rubbing her eyes to cleanse the gook from them. As she moved, the blanket tumbled down back to the bed, revealing a coat of hair as white as a midwinter blizzard. A messy cobalt mane, streaked with shades of steel, hung gracelessly around her features, hiding behind it a pair of soft, icy blue eyes. The earth pony rolled herself unceremoniously off of the mattress, making sure to tidy up the bed before sleepily trotting off into her apartment's bathroom to commence her morning rituals. After treating her teeth to a quick brushing, Snowstorm moved into her shower, reveling in the dissipation of tension from her muscles, thanks to the warm water trickling down her smaller body and dampening her coat into an off-white color. Her spirits lifted with the stream of the warm water, and soon enough, a bright grin had cemented itself on her face. She might have even sung a song, had she a voice to sing with. Unfortunately, a cruel twist of fate and the loss of her dear brother had stricken her mute years ago. By shower's end, she was soaked, limber, awake, and ready to tackle the day. And what a day it was going to be. Her class had a difficult test today, and she had to be prepared to face it. What's worse, the test was going to be an all-day affair, with little opportunity for breaks. She smiled at the mirror as she fixed her mane into a more manageable strand, received a smile in return from the mare staring back at her. It didn't matter how hard or how long one little test was. She loved her class dearly, and would be there to help any pony who needed it. Her saddlebags packed, Snowstorm trotted out of her apartment, and eventually outside, heading toward her first stop of the day. The bell sitting on the fruit stand rang out as a hoof gently touched it, notifying its owner that a customer had arrived. The not-quite-yellow stallion behind the stand snapped his eyes open. A lock of his lime-green mane fluttered down to in front of his eyes, which he quickly raked back with annoyance. A bright smile gradually lit Mosley Orange's face as he completely brought his head up from his nap, carefully considering the pony standing before him.
Good morning there, Lady Snow. I bet I know what you're here for. A nice plump juicy orange, right?
Her smile never left her face as she shook her head like a little filly, giving the stallion an eye roll for good measure. It was a game these two have had ever since she was knee-high to her brother. Mr. Orange had for the life of him tried to get her to eat one of his famous and presumably delicious oranges, but she had a singular taste for one thing from his fruit stand, and one thing only. "An apple a day keeps the doctor away," her brother had told her. She had clung to every word he uttered as she grew up with him, and that one simple rhyme had stuck to her mind. Besides, nothing beat a good juicy apple for breakfast.
"Oh, I will have you in my orangey clutches one of these days, Snowy,"
Mossly Orange declared as he removed the fruit from the bag, revealing it to be an apple all along.
"You're fortunate my nieces like to send so many. You just may have to starve without these."
He gave her a small wink and accepted the 3 bits she had procured. In return, she brought her hoof up to her mouth, gesturing her laughter for him.
"You best run along now, young lady,"
he admonished playfully after finishing his own round of chortling.
"I'm quite aware your class does not appreciate tardiness."
As she nodded and turned away to trot for the door, Mossly Orange ever so slyly dropped another apple into her saddlebag, satisfied the young mare had not noticed his action. Snowstorm, however, grinned as she munched on her first apple, instantly feeling the slight shift in weight, as another, this time free, apple had dropped into her right saddlebag. She would have turned around and given the older stallion a hug of gratitude, but he had been right. Her class awaited. Snowstorm's heels clicked against the concrete sidewalk as she gaily trotted down the path. All around her, ponies greeted her with a cheery good morning, or a bright smile. It was what she considered the good part of Manhattan. The part where a colt always guided an elderly dame across the street. The part where that didn't matter because the carriages would always stop and wait for any pedestrians to cross anyway. The part where, in short, every pony treated each other with dignity and kindness, and no one locked their doors at night. Snowstorm only wished she could have responded with more than just a smile or a wave. She could recall a time, vaguely, when she did have a voice. Her brother, that ever-gentle stallion known as Froststorm, had once told her that her voice was like water running off of crystal. She had given an honest effort to speaking again after she had lost him, but no matter how hard she tried, no sound would come out. It was as if the part of her brain controlling speech had completely shut down. After a while, she found she stopped minding altogether. Every pony became accustomed to her own body language, and she always kept a notepad and a pencil in her saddlebags. One of the many life skills Froststorm had imparted onto her was the ability to write. He had taught her a lot of things, had even been her primary caregiver and tutor. They were always too poor for proper schooling, so Froststorm had taken it upon himself to teach her everything he possibly could. That trail of thought slowly led to her parents, a trail that never failed to ignite a small spark of anger. They had abandoned her and Froststorm when she was barely a month old, forcing the young colt to care for her by himself. She knew because Frosty had told her when she was old enough to comprehend it. At that time, she didn't care. She only knew that Frosty was there, and they weren't, and that had been enough for her. But the years went on, and she began to think on it more and more, especially after losing him. She would ask herself why some pony would do that, or how could they in the first place? A deep part of her even blamed them for Frosty's death. If they had just been there, he wouldn't be gone. Snowstorm shook her head at once. There was no sense in going over this territory again, especially since she finally realized she was standing by the door to her school. Pushing the malevolent thoughts away, she quickly regained her bright smile and trotted inside. "Good morning, class," Snowstorm wrote on the chalkboard, turning around to favor each of her students with a bright smile. "Good morning, Miss Storm," they replied in unison. Students from mere foal years up to mare and stallionhood had formed into their typical double-file line and stood at 10 abreast, all of them comfortably in their training gi and eagerly awaiting today's test. She beamed at them all before turning back around to write out the concept of today's test. "Today is a very big day for you. So far, you've only learned how to hit, but you cannot know how to truly hit unless you've been hit. So it will be my duty to teach you that lesson." She mimicked a little giggle, following the rest of her class. "I have arranged the appropriate gear so that no pony gets hurt. After each of you have taken a turn feeling what it's like, you will pair up with a partner and reflect on it. After lunch, you and your partner will spar with each other until the end of class, or until you become tired. Are there any questions?" When she turned around after asking her question, she thankfully saw all heads shaking in denial. She spat out the disgusting chalk, licking the top of her gums to get rid of the thick tastelessness, while her students each geared up and took their place in line, from youngest to oldest. One by one, the students took their turns, some of them gulping audibly at the very idea of being on the receiving end of their teacher's deceptively powerful hooves. The first of her students to bravely face the first test was a young colt named Sideswipe. He stood before her, grinning both defiantly and excitedly up at his teacher. "Come on, give it your best shot," his face seemed to say. She smiled pleasantly down at him, before bowing her head in a gesture of respect her own master had taught her. Sideswipe copied the bow, and quickly returned to the prepared stance she had shown them all the very first day. Without hesitation, Snowstorm struck, landing her left forehoof squarely in the center of the colt's padded vest, putting enough force into the blow for him to feel and appreciate the sensation, without actually harming him.
Wow.
Sideswipe muttered after it was over, stripping his vest off and rubbing his chest just a little. "Just imagine if I were striking you for real, and without protection," Snowstorm wrote on the chalkboard, drawing a large underline beneath the entire sentence for added emphasis. She set the chalk down and tapped the board, making sure they read and truly understood today's lesson. They walked up to their first test, one at a time, with the words solidly in their mind. But as she struck, gently for the foals and slightly harder for the older ponies, the lesson completely cemented itself in their brains. By lunchtime, every student was conversing with their partner about the upcoming true test, not with the excited buzz of a group of ponies eagerly awaiting to legally and safely fight each other, but with the quiet, contemplative drone that only true dedication and serious study can bring out. Some of the students had been hit long before they ever attended Snowstorm's dojo, of course. Be it through simple bullying at school, Sideswipe was an example of this, Snowstorm reflected as she quietly ate her second apple and swept her gaze across the class. Or getting into an impromptu boxing ring on the streets and fighting for bits, as was the case of the adolescent stallion every pony referred to as Southpaw. Snowstorm smiled as she recalled the first day he was in her class. At first, his parents had forced him into it as an outlet for his aggression, and hoping the mental discipline would help him mold into a better example for his siblings, luring him with the prospect of getting to beat up other ponies and get away with it. Of course, Southpaw challenged Snowstorm, declaring that he could easily take her down for being both a mare and physically petite. He had snarled when she merely mimicked laughing at his so-called threats, and lunged when she had turned back towards the chalkboard. In a flash, she had struck out a rear leg, landing the adolescent in the gut. Before he knew what was happening, she had flipped him over onto his stomach and sat squarely on his back, bowing as the class was first stunned and then applauded, themselves not quite believing in her abilities to teach them all self-defense until they saw the unplanned demonstration for themselves. And after only a few short weeks, as Snowstorm looked at the very adolescent whom she was thinking about, she couldn't help but still be amazed by his complete turnaround. He had become respectful, always ready with a "yes, sir," or "please, ma'am," and never once backing out of volunteering to help a struggling student. His grades in Manhattan High had vastly improved. His own parents had sobbed that particular fact out to Snowstorm one evening, profusely thanking her for shaping him into a fine, upstanding stallion. The Southpaw at the beginning of this year was not the Southpaw she had now, and for that she was both proud and grateful. Soon every pony was finished with their meals, prompting Snowstorm to stand up and watch as they put their training vests back on. She cast a quick glance at the clock and smiled. 1 o'clock, giving them 6 whole hours for her class to spar with themselves. Perfect. "All right, class," she wrote, feeling their eyes turn towards the chalkboard as she wrote upon it. "Gear up. The real test begins now." For the remainder of the class, Snowstorm carefully walked around the room, closely observing the multiple pairs of students as they partook in what she referred to as the mid-year exam. More than just a lesson on the sensation of being it was really the culmination of all their studies so far, from how to pose correctly up to how to control the precision of one's attack. It was also a milestone for her students, the very first time they were able to officially spar with each other. Snowstorm quietly moved over to watch Sideswipe, noting with pride that the young colt didn't at all seem fazed by her presence, and instead focused wholly on his opponent, She had partnered up with a copper-red, blonde-maned farm filly his own age, named Haymaker. Their teacher smiled as she watched them trade blows, thinking about the mutual crush the foals had developed for each other. With Haymaker living on a large farm just outside of Manhattan, and being homeschooled so she would have more time to help with the family's alfalfa business, the only opportunity these two had to see each other was Snowstorm's class. Always observing and never ignorant, Snowstorm had noticed the small embers of a foalhood affection building into a full-fledged crush, and constantly paired the two together. They were still bashful with each other, as children often will be, but today the shyness had been replaced with excited enjoyment. Snowstorm blinked as she watched them closer. Haymaker had taken the offensive, swiping and jabbing at her opponent. Sideswipe dodged and wove, anticipating every attack. It was almost as if they were a couple entranced in a dance. Sideswipe was agile, Snowstorm observed, but Haymaker was a smart fighter. The colt hopped aside from another of her attacks, seeing too late that it had just been a simple feint and was hit squarely in his vest, offering the filly a slight grunt from her surprisingly strong blow.
"Oh no, did I hurt you?"
Haymaker asked, sitting down for a moment and wiping what seemed like an ocean of sweat from her brow.
"No,
Sideswipe answered, doing the same as he smiled at her.
it was a good hit. You're really strong."
He complimented, not knowing what else to say and just wanting to hear her squeaky voice.
"Yeah, it's probably all that hay that I helped lift."
Haymaker twisted her hoof back and forth into the mat, focusing all of her will into not blushing. By that point, Snowstorm had drifted off to let the two love-struck foals live in their own little world, martial arts forgotten for only a moment, as they both caught their second winds. Soon enough, they were back on their feet and back at each other, dodging and weaving, feinting and sweeping. As the hours marched on, some of the students decided to call it quits early, which was perfectly fine by their teacher. Every pony had their limits, and it was not the right time yet for her to push them beyond. By class's end, all of the students were coated with layers of sweat, each huffing heavily from their intense sparring. A few even showed off the bruises they had acquired through a mistimed attack, or dodging to the wrong place at the wrong time. Sideswipe and Haymaker favored each other with a nervous smile, each getting picked up by their parents and going their separate ways until tomorrow, when they could see each other again. Southpaw offered to walk home a slightly younger colt who had begun to idolize him as a big brother, which the youth excitedly accepted. One by one, they filed out of the dojo, with Snowstorm exiting last. She took a deep breath of fresh air and quietly suspected all of her students had done the same. By the end, the dojo had reeked of sweat and hard work, and the students fulfilled their final duty of the day by cleaning out the room, giving it a pristine shine, and preparing it for the next day's lessons. Snowstorm stopped again at Mosley Orange's stand for a couple of apples, giving her thanks for the earlier free one by way of a warm hug. Afterwards, happily savoring one of the apples she had just bought, the pure white mare trotted towards her home with the sun to her back, thinking about her students. She thought about how their day was complete, and they could relax comfortably at home, spending precious quality time with their families, and simply enjoying life. And she thought about how her own day had only just begun. Snowstorm shut the door to her apartment with her rear leg, breathing a deep sigh as she turned around to relock it. Despite living in the better part of Manhattan, where one could sleep soundly at night, she would keep her living quarters locked whenever possible. After all, Snowstorm had a secret, and she couldn't afford any pony learning of it. She slipped out of her training gi, tossing it into the laundry bin as she took a fast shower, washing away today's sweat and preparing for tonight's. There was no cheery overtone this time, however. Her mood had rapidly fallen into a sullen, downcast thing. She barely noticed the warm water hitting her this time, simply staring at the wetted shower floor and asking herself why she must do what she does, wondering when, or really if, it will ever end. Of course not, she told herself with a frown as she absent-mindedly finished with her shower. It'll never be over. If not me, it would be some pony else. Some pony who couldn't handle it. All dried up, Snowstorm's heart pounded almost audibly against her chest as she made her way over to the large oak dresser she had placed across from her bed, opening the bottom drawer to reveal a seemingly untidy mountain of clothes. But she knew precisely what she was searching for, and found both items where she had buried them in the far corner of the drawer, as she had always done and always will do. If any pony were to discover what she had kept hidden, it would spell the end for her. She stared down at the deep blue mask she clutched in her forehooves, seeing a reflection in the silver, expressionless eyes. Her legs shook harder, with a combination of fear and anger the longer she held the soft, stretching fabric. It was another of her strange rituals she went through, and this one was unpleasant. Her breathing became heavy, her teeth grinding as she glanced over to her side, eyes falling upon her favorite picture she possessed of herself and Froststorm. And the picture took her back. Back to the when. Back to the why. She didn't want to go, but she needed to. But dear Celestia, was it ever a harsh journey? It all happened roughly 5 years ago. Froststorm had something special planned for his little sister's birthday. She had always wanted to visit Ponyville, had heard about what a quaint little friendly town it was from Mosley Orange. The older sire knew because his niece, and the kindly mare whom always sent him a bushel of her apples, resided there. Snowstorm had wanted to see her most of all, to tell her how much she enjoyed the apples. The brother and sister pair had tried to take a shortcut through what she referred to as the bad part of town, the part where a dark cloud would always loom over you, sometimes literally. The part where ponies weren't so friendly towards each other. The part where bad things happen. They had been cut off by a small-time gang looking to earn themselves a reputation. They had demanded Froststorm give them the little filly, and they'd let him go free. He stood defiantly in front of her miniature scale, and for the first time in her life, she had been afraid. He had yelled at her to run away as fast as possible, but that had only made her even more scared. He had never once raised his voice to her, not even when she had been caught doing or saying things she shouldn't have. He stamped his foot onto the ground, and that had woken her up. She bolted in the direction they had been going, not knowing if anyone was chasing her, and never once looking back. The tears blew out of her eyes as she galloped straight to Ponyville, never once stopping, even to eat the apples she had in her saddlebags. Her legs had felt like rubber as she put everything she had into them. A stitch had embedded itself into her side, burning her lungs with an intense fire. Her legs splashed in the puddles and caught in the mud as the rain poured down with a torrential fury, as if the goddess Epona herself were weeping for the sibling who had just been lost. Still, she had run. She had finally reached a barn which stood overlooking an orchard, a vast apple orchard, though she didn't register that fact at the time. Her legs had finally given out in front of the barn's large crossed doors, and she fell into the thick mud with a splat. She never minded the mud that seeped beneath her coat and cemented itself onto her skin. She only cried. She had cried every last tear her small body could possibly produce, and cried more just for good measure. That night she had completely cried her own voice away. As her tears mingled with the rain that pelted her coat, a figure came up, looming above her like a giant, and casting her in a large shadow. She looked up and gasped as a blank blue face with silver eyes stared back at her. The rest of the figure was clad in a violet outfit, complemented by an oversized round-brim hat and long flowing cape. She had expected the figure to have a thundering voice, a voice of authority and command. Instead, it was kind, gentle, and heavily accented.
Hey there, Sugar Cube.
The figure said, pulling back its face and revealing what lay underneath. A river of blonde spilled out from beneath the mask, resting atop and around a face as orange as the sunrise. Her emerald eyes were warm, soft, loving.
Why are you crying? Come on, y'all can tell me.
Snowstorm only shook her head, trying to croak out words, but not feeling anything. A new wave of fear set in as the realization sunk in that she had lost her voice. But this mare towering above her seemed not to be fazed.
Well, that's all right. Take your time, that's all. In the meantime, you should come inside. A little filly like you could get sick out here in this rain. I'm Applejack, by the way.
And so she had. Snowstorm discovered she could still write, and chose to communicate with Applejack through written words. The first thing she asked about was the interesting costume.
Well, shucks. It was just the thing my friends and I did to teach our other friend a lesson about not being full of yourself. We call ourselves Mare-do-well. But shoo, I prefer being Applejack over Mare-do-well any day.
Can I have the suit? Applejack blinked, making sure she had read the words right. After 3 rereadings, she confirmed that the question was indeed real.
Well, I don't see a reason why not.
And so, Snowstorm gained the suit, promising Applejack that she would do right by it. A week after a disastrous arrival in Ponyville, the young filly set out on the adventure of her lifetime, first returning to Manhattan to make sure her brother received the proper burial he deserved. Afterwards, she left the city behind her, trekking across all of the Equus continent and building every attribute in her arsenal, as well as learning every form of self-defense she could possibly handle. Years afterward, she had made an anticlimactic return to an unchanged Manhattan. The good part was still the good part, and the bad part was slowly delving into the worst part. That night, she had climbed the skyscrapers, as she had learned to climb the largest trees in the ebony forests of Anhalter. She had stood at the peak of her concrete jungle, unwrapping her saddlebags, and for the first time, donning the violet and blue costume she had acquired from the apple farmer years before. That night, she had silently declared to all of Manhattan that Mare-do-well had arrived. She gazed at the mask again, her hoofs now trembling furiously as she fully remembered the why of what she did every single night. She did it so that no other foal would go through what she had gone through, so that no other foal would have to unnecessarily experience the unfathomable pain of loss, especially by the malicious hooves of a stupid thug. She slipped on the costume, skin tingling as the stretching, breathable fabric contorted to her physique with the utmost comfort. She pulled at the front of the neck, kissing Froststorm's face on the picture, before securely sliding it into her suit. The only modification she had made to it was a small pocket where she could keep the photo right above her heart, so that Frosty would always be there with her, always ready to protect her like he had done on that fateful night. She drew one last deep breath of fresh air and slid the mask down over her face. She was Mare-do-well, and she had a city to protect. For her brother. For Frosty.
Hey there, this is Repairman Man reading Twilight Finds a Book of Puns by a troll?
Well, this is interesting.
Twilight's horn glowed as she pulled a dusty old book out of one of the shelves. Stuck all the way in the corner of the library, the shelf wasn't used much, and the books weren't usually read. However, Twilight had read mostly all of the books in the library, including all the new ones that had just come in the day before. This book was dusty, and Twilight had never seen it before. She blew on the cover, pushing a sheet of dust off of it and revealing the title.
The Equestrian Dictionary of Puns?
She said, brushing off the book of any remaining dust. The book was large, almost the size of the normal dictionary, and had pages filled with spaced-out puns. Twilight delved into the book, opening to the first page and reading quickly. By the time it was noon, she had already finished the entire book. Inside her head, puns bounced around, covering her mind. She looked around, and every object she saw was now an object of pun. Looking at the clock, she saw there was about noontime, and that she had promised to meet her friends near the fountain in the central square. Placing the book back into the shelf, she trotted out of the library and toward the fountain.
Hey, girls!
Called Twilight, trotting up to her group of friends as they waited for her by the fountain.
Hey, Twilight, how's it going?
Said Rainbow Dash, stopping her conversation with Applejack.
It's not too bad.
Said Twilight, staring at the fountain behind them.
What are you up to?
Nothing much. We were actually just planning to go by the beach a couple minutes outside of Ponyville. Want to come?
I'd love to, as long as it doesn't take a mile to get there.
What?
Nothing.
The ponies all agreed that going to the beach would be the best idea on such a hot day, so they began their trek. They trotted through Ponyville, going through the central square that was bustling with ponies. Applejack decided to stop and buy an apple for a snack.
1 apple, please,
said Applejack, sliding 1 bit to the pony behind the stand. She came back with 2 apples, even though the sign said that was 1 bit per apple. Applejack picked the apples one at a time, eating one whole right as she took it off of the stand.
I thought that each apple was 1 bit. How did you get 2?
Said Rarity as Applejack chewed on her apple.
She must be an insider in the apple business,
Chimed Twilight. Applejack swallowed her apple.
Twilight's right. Us here apple-growing folk are in the business together, which means discounts.
Rarity nodded.
It's nothing like that in the fashion business.
That's probably because it's so competitive. Every fashion designer wants their competition's store to close.
I suppose you're right, Twilight.
Twilight frowned. None of her friends were picking up on her brilliant use of puns. She had to up the usage, and fast, if she wanted the dictionary to be of any use to her. The ponies exited Ponyville and entered a forest filled with tall trees that were spaced out just enough to allow the sunlight to come through.
Would you look at this? Leave it to nature to make paths like these beautiful,
said Twilight, looking around at everything around her.
I'm not so fond of these ferns, but that's oak, because if you look around, the trees spruce things up.
Twilight, stop using puns!
You've noticed?
Said Twilight, a smile coming to her face.
Oh, we've all noticed, Twilight,
said Applejack.
And it's annoying,
finished Rarity.
Sorry,
said Twilight, putting on a sheepish smile.
I didn't know you weren't a fan of my pleasantry.
Applejack groaned.
Will you stop making bad jokes, Twilight?
Sorry, I've got them rooted in my brain.
If you're gonna tell jokes, tell them later. Right now we need to focus on getting to the beach,
said Rainbow Dash.
But Rainbow Dash, there is no time for rest. I can't save these jokes for later.
Twilight let out a small giggle as Rainbow Dash rolled her eyes.
Twilight, even I don't think these are funny,
said Pinkie Pie.
Yes, Twilight, please stop these bad jokes,
said Rarity.
I see you're sick of more puns, but I hope you stick around because they're just blooming and I'm liking them.
Twilight broke out into a wide smile, unable to hide her glee any longer. She thought the puns were hilarious, while every pony else just groaned at the sound of them.
Twilight, stop. Even Fluttershy is tired of them.
Well,
She bowed her head.
it's true. I don't really like them.
She croaked in a raspy voice. Twilight looked at Fluttershy.
Fine, I'll stop, but you will owe me one.
With a final groan, the ponies silently made their way through the forest and to the beach, lest they talk and spur more puns from Twilight. They finally made their way out of the forest and into the sandy beach area. Nearby was a tall cliff overlooking the blue water. It could almost be considered a mountain had it not been over the water. Twilight started to smile, and the water section of the dictionary flooded into her mind.
Hey, look, it's the ocean! Every pony wave!
Before the ponies could groan, Twilight was already on to her next pun.
I'm sure we'll have a fun time here, but if you see a storm, we'll have to leave. I'm getting a little tongue-tied with all these puns, but they're cracking me up. I shall not bait any longer. Let's go test the water.
Twilight, stop, said a bemused Applejack.
Well, I guess I caught. But what are we going to do? This trip has no purpose if I can't make puns.
Seriously, Twilight? It's getting old,
said Rarity.
Peer pressure has no effect on me.
No pony likes your puns,
said Rainbow Dash. The ponies gave up. There was no stopping Twilight. Suddenly, Spike came running through the forest and into the beach holding a letter from Celestia. He had hair above his lip.
Twilight, I must ask you a question.
All right, what is it?
Did you see Celestia about sending the dresses to Neptune?
Dresses on Neptune? It's freezing up there. What is going on, Twilight?
Nothing, Rarity. I just wanted to have the coolest outfits.
Spike and Twilight broke out into laughter. Rarity started to giggle, and it eventually grew into a laugh. Rainbow Dash, Pinkie Pie, and Applejack all joined in, finding humor in the pun. Fluttershy remained silent.
What's wrong, Fluttershy? You didn't find it funny?
Asked Twilight after she had finished laughing.
I did, but I don't really want to laugh.
Said Fluttershy. She paused for a moment.
Because I'm a little hoarse.
Big Brother by Bob Scribbler. Dawn. Applejack was missing. Big Macintosh stared at her empty bed. The covers had been neatly turned down. That would be Granny Smith's doing. She turned down the covers every evening, as if she was convinced one night a tiny orange filly would scramble through the window, fall asleep, and come down to breakfast like nothing had happened. He wasn't stupid. It had taken twice as long for him to learn multiplication in school, and he needed to sound out long words in books. Didn't really like reading at all unless he was alone and nobody could see his lips moving. But he wasn't stupid. Convincing the rest of the world there was a difference between slow and stupid, however, was an ongoing struggle. Applejack had never treated him like he was stupid. She was so much younger. She listened, enrapt, as he explained working on the farm to her, and thought he was the smartest pony in the world. She wasn't old enough to use language he couldn't understand when he read her note. He pictured it, full of tooth marks and spit stains from being constantly pulled from under the china angel on the mantelpiece where she had left it. They all knew it by heart. It didn't make coping any easier. Treading as delicately as he could, which wasn't very, but Granny was practically deaf, so it didn't matter, Big Macintosh crossed the room and nudged Applejack's pillow to fluff it. It was his own private ritual. Granny turned down covers, he fluffed pillows. They both set out an extra plate at mealtimes, and then refused to look at the unused plate. He was the stallion of the family now Pa was gone. He was supposed to look out for his little sister, but he had obviously done something wrong if she had just up and left without saying a word. He wasn't given much to introspection. Couldn't spell it if told to write it down, but that bothered him. Why had she been so unhappy? Was she really so dissatisfied with life at Sweetapple Acres that she had to leave it, and them? He sighed and went on to the window. It was dawn, bright light cresting the horizon like paint on a dark canvas. He had barely slept. That wouldn't do. He had work to finish today. Granny couldn't manage the bucking anymore.
She tried, but it was mostly his job, since her arthritis took hold. He had to get bigger and stronger so he could take care of things the way the stallion of the family was supposed to.
He stayed at the window, thinking his private thoughts until the sky exploded. That was how it seemed, at least. A wash of multicolored light detonated and shot outward over the farm. Birds of the dawn chorus abandoned their song to squawk and fly in all directions. Dozens of rabbits, squirrels, and other small animals dashed about the orchard. A crashing noise followed seconds after the rainbow explosion, as if the universe was stamping its hooves.
What's that?
Granny burst through the door, bleary-eyed but alert.
Did the boiler explode again?
Big Macintosh tossed his head at the quivering sky. The ring of colored light was still traveling away in the distance like a giant ripple in the fabric of reality. His mouth hung open, but he couldn't help himself. He had never seen anything like it before.
What in tarnation?
Granny squinted at it.
The heck is that?
Big Macintosh didn't know. A strange feeling coalesced in his belly. He wouldn't realize until later that it was excitement. That rainbow ring was a portent, or a sign, or something else significant for which he didn't have words. He could feel it in his fetlocks.
Granny?
He said slowly.
What is it, youngin'?
Applejack.
Where?
She scanned the road.
Dang filly! Wild as a June bug on a string! I don't see her!
Not yet.
He smiled, even though he couldn't yet hear the clatter of tiny orange hooves.
Soon.
You think?
Yep.
He turned from the window.
Gonna wait for her at the gate.
Granny watched him with narrowed eyes.
You'll be wasting good bucking time.
Yep.
You must be sure if you're willing to neglect bucking.
Yep.
A smile creased her wrinkled face.
Good enough for me.
Midday. Big Macintosh stood at the crest of the hill and watched his sister and her friend darting between the trees. The midday sun dappled orange and blue coats as the two little ponies played. No matter how old she acted, or how much responsibility she tried to take on, Applejack was still a filly at heart. It would be a couple more years before she could reasonably be called a mare, and he would have to start worrying about stallions courting her. In his humble opinion, she should act like a filly as much as she could while she could. But the only time she let her guard down seemed to be when that little blue Pegasus came calling. He was standing in plain view, but neither filly spotted him. They were too absorbed in chasing each other in some complicated game of tag mixed with hide-and-seek and rugby. The Pegasus arrowed up between the branches. A swish of leaves was the only indication that she had gone. He watched Applejack canter into view, spot the leaves, and pretend not to see them. She slowed to a trot, but when the Pegasus tried to surprise her from above, she was ready. Somehow slowed her body to one side and turned the madcap roll into her pinning the other pony.
"I win!"
she crowed. The Pegasus spat out a mouthful of leaves. Her rainbow mane and tail were studded with twigs and bits of bark.
"No way!" "Yes way."
Another roll and their positions were reversed. A single leaf was stuck to the Pegasus' flank. It looked like a little cutie mark, but flaked away to reveal the actual mark underneath. Yup, on their way to becoming mares, but still fillies in all the ways that counted.
"No way!"
Applejack blew out a breath.
"Gosh darn it, you weigh a ton! No more apple pies for you." "What?"
The Pegasus was aghast.
"No fair! I love apple pies." "I can tell. You're breaking my ribs." "Aw, man."
The Pegasus beat her wings and lifted her weight off, only for Applejack to launch herself and reverse their positions once more.
"I can't believe you fell for that."
Applejack grinned.
"I let you win." "Sure you did. Oh, look, there goes a flying pig."
The Pegasus blinked.
"Now that'll be awesome."
Applejack made a face.
"You think everything will be better with wings." "Well, it would." "Nuh-uh." "Uh-huh. Imagine raccoons and rabbits and squirrels with wings. They'd be so much cooler than they are now." "It'll be gosh darn awful. They'd reach all the apples before we can pick 'em." "Nuh-uh, because you'd have wings too, so you could chase them off. You wouldn't have to learn to buck anymore either. You could just take the apples right off the branches." "But I like bucking. Why would I want wings?" "Duh! Because everything would be awesome with wings." "I'm awesome just the way I am." "Nuh-uh." "I beat you today without wings, didn't I?"
The Pegasus pouted.
"Totally not awesome."
Big Macintosh allowed a small smile to turn up his mouth. Yup, it sure did do Applejack good to act like a filly sometimes. He turned away and hid behind some bushes before she could see him and demand a bucking lesson instead. Dusk. There was a lot of satisfaction to be had in doing a simple job well. Apple bucking was a balance of strength and accuracy, but not exactly academic. Neither was Big Macintosh. He had long ago reconciled himself to his shortcomings and no longer felt like he had to justify himself to the world. Either ponies accepted him the way he was, or they didn't and weren't worth knowing anyhow. This had definitely been a Valentine's Day to remember. Or not. Usually bucking helped him order his thoughts, but today had left him in such a tizzy he was still reshelving a few things in his head. He kicked out with one hind leg, and a tumble of red delicious landed in each of the 3 baskets he had positioned. Taking a handle between his teeth, he dragged each to the cart and maneuvered them up the ramp. When he was done, he checked to make sure that he hadn't missed any, and arranged himself in the harness to pull the entire load through the orchard for checking. Granny would take out the bad ones and save what she could, turning the others into mash for compost or one of those liniments she kept for when he or Applejack pulled a muscle. He looked around as he walked, wondering where the heck his sister was. She had been due to help him today, but in all the confusion with Cheerilee, he had forgotten. Now, trying to cram all the work into his evening, he felt the slight stirring of resentment that Applejack had apparently used his absence to sneak away and do her own thing. He frowned at the resentment until it skittered away back into its box. Applejack wasn't that kind of pony. She wouldn't skeeve work unless something important had come up, which, given some of the things she had gotten mixed up in since Twilight Sparkle came to town, could be just about anything. Had another dragon attacked? Was she helping rescue a friend from underground jewel thieves? Could she have been whisked away to Canderlot on Princess Celestia's orders? He was still impressed that a practical, down-home pony from their family was hobnobbing with the upper crust without picking up all sorts of silly airs and graces. Applejack was as level-headed today as she had ever been since the day she got her cutie mark, and he was proud of her. He dragged the cart into the barn, and was unloading the baskets when he noticed the ladder from the hayloft on the floor. Usually it sat by the hayloft door, leading down to the floor, but it had fallen or been kicked over. He couldn't park the cart after unloading it with it there, so he hastily stashed the baskets where Granny could reach them in the morning and grip the ladder between his teeth. It took 2 smaller ponies to maneuver the thing usually. Applejack and Applebloom typically worked together, since Granny could barely move her withers to pick up more than apples these days. It was no trouble for him, however. He gently placed it up and put it back where it should be. As he turned away, the sound of movement made his ears twitch. It was coming from the hayloft. He turned back, thinking it may be a raccoon or stray squirrel that had got in. Once an entire family of grickles had nestled up there, and he had been forced to carry each squalling, scratching lizard bird down individually in special unbreakable carriers Twilight had whipped up for him. He hoped it wasn't more grickles, although that would account for why the ladder had been kicked down. Grickles were notoriously territorial when they chose a nesting spot. He climbed the ladder quietly, not wanting a face full of claws when he reached the top. He couldn't smell anything bad, but that was the indicator. Peering cautiously over the top rung, he froze. Well, it sure wasn't grickles. Applejack slept curled in the hay, her tail over her nose. It was how she used to sleep under her blankets as a filly when the boiler blew and the farmhouse grew especially cold. Behind her, mouth open and a glob of drool ready to fall, Rainbow Dash also sprawled asleep in the hay. Neither had heard him approach. They were both clearly exhausted. What made him pause, however, wasn't the fact that his sister was napping up here while he was busy working in the orchards. It was the casually possessive hoof Rainbow Dash had thrown over her flank, and the fact that she was wearing Applejack's hat. Applejack never let anyone wear her hat. She had been protected of it ever since Pa gave it to her on one of his rare visits home. Not even he or Applebloom were allowed to touch it. But there Rainbow Dash was, bold as brass, wearing it askew like it was her own. Big Macintosh stayed where he was for a long moment. He considered ducking out of sight and coughing to give them a chance to reorder themselves so they could all pretend things were as they had always been. As he was thinking this, however, Applejack shifted in her sleep, nuzzling backwards into the curve of Rainbow Dash's body. Her tail fell aside to reveal she was smiling in utter contentment. Big Macintosh descended the ladder with a soundlessness anyone would have been surprised at, given his suit plate hooves and massive body. He passed through the barn doors, but stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Going back to the ladder, he took it between his teeth and brought it down, using his knees to cushion the sound of it meeting the floor. It lay where it had been before it came in, giving no clue that he had moved it.
What's got you smiling like a fox with the key to the henhouse door?
Granny asked when he came into the kitchen.
You find a sweetheart today?
He thought about the question, and about Cheerilee.
Sorta.
Sorta? What kind of sweetheart is a sorta sweetheart?
Complicated.
Granny sighed.
You young folk never make nothing simple. You're getting long in the tooth to keep putting off settling down, Macintosh.
He shrugged.
Probably.
You need to find some pony special, get coupled, and be happy. You and Applejack both. She shouldn't get to your age and have no pony special to call her own, too.
He thought about the hayloft and smiled.
Not a problem, Granny.
You're smiling again.
She glared at him.
You gonna tell me why?
Nope.
Dang-nabbit! No pony tells me nothing no more. It's because I'm old, ain't it? Y'all think I'm too old and old-fashioned to know what's going on in your lives? I was young too once, you know.
She continued to grumble as she sliced apples to go on the pie crust sitting on the counter. Big Macintosh looked out of the window at the barn and just smiled.